Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the absurdly shiny life of a king who thought gold could fix literally everything, and spoiler, it could not. Picture this: Phrygia, a land full of hills, vineyards, and apparently more gold than common sense, had a king named Midas who genuinely had zero chill. He lounged on thrones that looked like they were carved by OCD elves, surrounded by treasures that would make Elon Musk blush. Yet still, somehow he was that guy who always wanted more. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, comment your location and local time, because it's important to know where in the world we're collectively losing it over ancient royal mistakes. Midas's obsession wasn't subtle. It was full-blown, all caps, neon sign level greed. The king didn't just want wealth. He wanted the idea of wealth, the shiny flecks that made neighbors jealous and strangers curious, the kind of sparkle that made peasants sigh while sweeping his golden streets. And honestly, who can blame him? Gold is aesthetically pleasing. It's Instagram perfect, timeless, and basically the OG luxury brand. But here's the kicker. Midas's fixation went beyond simple hoarding or collecting. He would literally measure happiness in carats, and trust me, that never ends well. Servants tiptoed around him like live-in accountants, constantly recalculating the kingdom's assets while praying their own toes didn't get turned into bullion. Advisors whispered things like, maybe, moderation, and Midas would chuckle, imagining moderation as a cute, laughable concept best left to poor kings in boring lands. Even his gardens screamed excess, fountains spouting not water, but glittering metals, hedges trimmed into dollar signs, and statues that looked suspiciously like him, just to make sure everyone knew who was boss. Of course, he had enemies, because humans are predictable, and people don't appreciate someone whose handshake could bankrupt them. But Midas didn't care. He had the kind of confidence that borders on delusion. He prided himself on his ability to turn ordinary things into symbols of his own brilliance, except, ironically, the thing he didn't realize he was about to turn into disaster was himself. The stage was set for a king whose wealth was legendary, whose judgment was questionable, and whose story was about to become a cautionary tale for anyone thinking they can outshine both the gods and common sense. The palace smelled like minted coins and hubris, a cocktail that would inevitably give anyone a hangover, metaphysical style. And as Midas lounged among his piles of gold, sipping maybe too much wine and pretending he understood the subtle art of power, the universe quietly rolled its eyes, already drafting plans for karma in metallic shades. Little did he know, his obsession with flexing and shiny aesthetics would soon collide with the kind of divine intervention that doesn't come with refunds or returns. The world of Phrygia, filled with songbirds, vineyards, and occasional suspicious glances from neighboring kingdoms, was about to meet a story so ludicrously rich it could only be true in myth, and yet, somehow, completely relatable to anyone who's ever chased a sparkle without reading the fine print. The story took a wild turn when Dionysus, the god of wine, who also doubled as the ancient world's ultimate party god and low-key life coach, found himself dealing with a little friend problem. His companion, a satyr named Silenus, had wandered off during a binge of vineyard hopping and philosophy lectures, basically the Greek equivalent of "I went out for one drink and ended up in the woods." Silenus stumbled into Midas's kingdom, drunk, exhausted, and probably smelling like a mix of grapes and bad decisions, which is exactly the vibe Midas lived for in guests: chaotic, entertaining, and somehow profitable. Most kings would have seen a drunken stranger and thought, yeah, nope, call the guards. But Midas, of course, saw an opportunity. He threw a welcome party that probably made event planners in 2026 sweat with anxiety. feasts laid out on tables that looked like golden nightmares, music that could only be described as a mashup between panpipes and someone hitting every wine jug in sight, and servants sprinting around like caffeinated squirrels. Silenus was treated like a rock star lost in time, and honestly, it was hard not to imagine Midas secretly taking notes for how to host a legendary party that doubles as a power move. Over 10 days, Midas fawned over the satyr with a mix of genuine hospitality and performative "look at how amazing I am" energy, offering the finest wines, rare delicacies, and probably one or two embarrassing attempts at wisdom. Silenus, meanwhile, soaked it all in with a mix of confusion, appreciation, and enough intoxicated honesty to make Midas question why his advisors were ever allowed to speak. And this is where the story starts to get really juicy. Dionysus, sitting somewhere in the divine realm, noticed his missing friend had basically become a Phrygian court celebrity. Naturally, the god was low-key, impressed but mostly concerned. Silenus was supposed to be on a spiritual wine retreat, not being pampered like a furry influencer. Midas's kingdom, in that short period, turned into a chaotic bubble of over-the-top hospitality, where the line between generosity and complete show-off airy blurred faster than anyone could track. Servants secretly judged their king while pretending to arrange grapes, and neighbors probably whispered about the madness that had descended, but Midas was in peak ego mode, thinking, yeah, this is how legends do brunch. The 10 days culminated in a series of awkwardly long hugs, philosophical musings about life that were mostly Midas talking, and Silenus occasionally mumbling, "Thanks, dude," while being too tipsy to grasp the full situation. By the end of it, Dionysus decided it was time to intervene, because gods have zero tolerance for losing friends to random mortal excess. And so, the stage was subtly set for a reward that sounded like a dream, but, as you might have guessed, would soon reveal itself as a nightmare wrapped in glitter. Midas, blissfully unaware that the universe was about to clap back with style, had just been put on the fast track to learning the hardest life lesson ever. Not every gift is actually a gift, especially when it comes from a god who knows your weaknesses. Midas's 10-day hospitality marathon reached peak absurdity when he decided that being a good host meant flexing every ounce of his wealth. And by flexing, I mean turning his palace into a literal museum of bad decisions. Tables groaned under the weight of exotic fruits that would have embarrassed modern-day influencers, and fountains gushed with wine so fine it made sommeliers across history weep with envy, which, if we're honest, is both impressive and utterly ridiculous. Servants ran like caffeinated ants, balancing trays of delicacies while mentally calculating how many lifetimes it would take to recover from their king's impulse spending. Guests, including minor nobles and traveling bards, marveled at the chaos, half in awe and half in that I should probably be worried way humans react when someone's ego outpaces their common sense. Midas, for his part, was living his best life, assuming that generosity and showmanship were basically interchangeable. He laughed at every joke, even the bad ones, and made speeches that sounded motivational but were mostly just long-winded reminders that he was, in fact, the richest guy in town. Wine sloshed, laughter echoed, and somewhere in the corner, a satyr nodded knowingly, having clearly seen enough human nonsense to last a few centuries. This period wasn't just a display of wealth, it was a psychological experiment in how much excess can one kingdom handle before someone inevitably loses it. Advisors whispered warnings about debt, mortality, and the fleeting nature of human attention spans, but Midas waved them off like a man swatting away fruit flies at a picnic he had personally catered with gold-encrusted utensils. Every day blurred into the next, a montage of indulgence slightly awkward philosophical chats, and Midas practicing dramatic gestures in mirrors because even kings needed rehearsal for being fabulous. Guests left with pockets empty of coins but heads full of stories to gossip about for decades, ensuring Midas's reputation as both a generous host and someone utterly unhinged spread far and wide. Meanwhile, Silenus, blissfully unaware of the future chaos this hospitality would trigger, napped under golden canopies, occasionally waking to eat grapes or give a hiccup-laden thumbs up. By the 10th day, Midas had essentially rewritten the rulebook for how to throw a party that annoys your neighbors and impresses your friends simultaneously, unaware that the final act of generosity would become the prelude to his own personal disaster. The kingdom smelled like roasted meats, wine, and impending regret, a combination both intoxicating and ominously foreshadowing. And as the sun set on the 10th night, Midas could not have predicted that the very god whose friend he had pampered was quietly observing the human who had managed to turn friendship into a spectacle that demanded reward. The universe, it seemed, was gearing up to hand Midas a gift wrapped in irony so thick it would leave him questioning whether wealth, power, or common sense mattered more. It was the calm before a storm of gold, literally, and the kind of scenario historians later summarized as peak hubris meets divine boredom. Midas, blissfully unaware, thought he had just proven his legendary generosity, not realizing he had unknowingly entered the prologue to a catastrophe shiny enough to blind anyone who dared flex too hard. The kingdom was a glittering stage, the actors oblivious, and the plot had only just begun. When Dionysus finally decided to intervene, it came wrapped in that classic god-level, "Here's your reward, but let's see how dumb you really are" energy. The god didn't storm in with thunder or lightning. He was far too classy for that. He just appeared with a grin that screamed both amusement and low-key judgment. He offered Midas a single wish, which, on paper, sounds like the kind of thing every human secretly dreams of. Unlimited opportunity, a cosmic get-out-of-broke-free card, and basically the ultimate flex package. Except, as anyone with basic life skills might suspect, giving a king who already had zero chill the ability to wish for anything is like handing a toddler a flamethrower and asking them to build a sandcastle. Midas, being Midas, didn't pause, hesitate, or even consult a human decency manual. He considered the options as if he were shopping on some mythical Amazon Prime. Immortality, wisdom, power over armies, divine charisma. And then he blinked, shrugged, and went for the one that screamed maximum chaos with zero foresight, the power to turn everything he touched into gold. It was peak short-sighted brilliance, the kind of decision that would later inspire centuries of memes about rich people being completely out of touch with reality. Dionysus, suppressing a smirk, granted the wish, probably thinking, let's see how long this genius lasts before choking on his own hubris. The irony was palpable. The god was giving Midas exactly what he asked for, in all its literal, absurd glory, while the kingdom held its collective breath for the inevitable disaster that would follow. Midas, naturally, was ecstatic, immediately running around the palace touching candlesticks, goblets, and random decorative fruit, all gleaming like someone had photoshopped the entire room in a gold filter. At first, it was everything he imagined, satisfying, shiny, and utterly intoxicating. But as any sensible human or Greek deity could predict, this kind of wish comes with a fine print, written in cosmic sarcasm. The palace shimmered like a metal-themed carnival. Servants blinked at walls that were suddenly unusable, and the birds outside probably judged the situation while tweeting metaphorical warnings. Dionysus, meanwhile, watched quietly from the sidelines, because gods enjoy reality TV too, especially when it's starring mortals making spectacularly bad choices. Midas's grin, a little too wide for human ergonomics, barely contained his glee as he imagined the envy of neighboring kings and wandering merchants. He didn't yet realize that the blessing had the subtle side effect of making literally everything in his immediate environment unusable in any practical sense. Food, drink, furniture, suddenly all glittering death traps. The kingdom had never looked more dazzling, and yet the first flickers of regret were already forming, like storm clouds behind gold-plated curtains. In short, what began as a reward meant to honor his hospitality quickly escalated into the kind of situation that would make anyone question their life choices, sanity, and the entire concept of be careful what you wish for. The stage was set for Midas to learn the hard way that sometimes absolute power isn't just corrupting, it's literally inedible. Midas, in his infinite wisdom, or lack thereof, made the kind of choice that historians, philosophers, and basically anyone with eyeballs would later describe as peak stupidity disguised as ambition. Faced with limitless divine options, he confidently picked the one that screamed, "I want to win at life, but also make everything inconvenient forever." By wishing that everything he touched turned to gold, he basically invited a shiny apocalypse into his own hands. The moment the words left his mouth, there was no turning back, and yet he strutted around as if he had just unlocked some legendary cheat code. The palace glimmered, the floors sparkled, and even the air felt suspiciously rich, which is to say, it was all very Instagram filtered, minus the option to undo. Initially, it was hilarious. Candlesticks, coins, and random furniture instantly became glittering treasures, and Midas felt like a human credit card ad come to life. Servants blinked in confusion while mentally calculating how long it would take to sweep a floor that now weighed several tons each step. Birds perched on windowsills were probably reconsidering evolution, while tiny animals scuttled past, thinking, "Do I want to live here, or just die quietly?" Every touch reinforced the king's delusion that he had achieved peak flex status, a sort of ancient, "look at me, I can literally turn my problems into gold" energy. Yet, like every bad life decision, the consequences began their slow creep almost immediately. A stray apple on the table solidified into a golden fruit that couldn't be eaten. A cup of water hardened mid-sip, and Midas's own reflection in a gilded mirror made him question whether vanity had ever been worth it. Despite the obvious red flags, the king was too busy reveling in the novelty of the situation to care, poking statues, tapping coins, and basically treating the kingdom like his own personal TikTok studio, except with more existential risk. The servants exchanged glances that screamed silent, "We're doomed," while attempting to maintain the illusion of normalcy, shuffling trays that now weighed a metric ton and hoping their jobs wouldn't literally turn into gold bricks overnight. Meanwhile, Midas ignored everything practical, food, drink, comfort, in favor of the thrill that came from touching every object and watching it glint under candlelight. The first hints of regret, however, were inevitable. There was no pause button, no undo option, and certainly no manual on how not to ruin your life while chasing a shiny obsession. And as the king continued to explore the boundaries of his newly acquired power, the universe, meticulously patient and highly amused, prepared to introduce him to the one rule of gold that no mortal ever really learns until it's too late. Not everything that glitters is worth having, especially when it bites back. Midas had essentially signed a contract with literal consequences, and even as he danced around the palace in euphoric ignorance, the seeds of disaster were already sparkling right under his feet. At first, Midas was riding a literal high, the kind of "I am the king of everything shiny" energy that makes you want to hum a personal theme song and toss coins at peasants for fun. He strutted through the palace corridors like a golden centaur on steroids, tapping walls, tables, and basically anything within arm's reach, each touch producing a satisfying metallic ping that sounded like a wealth-themed ASMR track. Gold flowed under his fingers as if the universe itself had decided, "Fine, have your shiny playground, but don't complain later." Every trinket, every utensil, and every ridiculous ornamental fruit became instantly valuable beyond imagination, which made Midas feel like the ultimate billionaire in training, flexing for a crowd of invisible Instagram followers. He even attempted to hug a servant, thinking, surely some human warmth will survive this. But spoiler, physics had other ideas. Gold is not huggable, apparently. Coins clinked, furniture creaked under its newfound density, and Midas's grin widened, oblivious to the creeping reality that his human interactions were about to take a nosedive. The palace transformed from a cozy kingdom into a metallic maze, corridors echoing with the awkward sound of unyielding gold whenever anyone dared walk too fast, and servants tiptoed as though they were traversing a treasure-laden minefield. The king's sense of triumph was absolute, bordering on obnoxious. He held up a candlestick like a trophy and declared victory over nature, time, and taste itself. But as he explored further, he realized that the sheer omnipresence of gold was starting to feel less like luxury and more like a trap. The floors gleamed blindingly, reflections bounced off every surface, and shadows were swallowed in glints so bright that even Midas occasionally squinted, which, to be honest, is probably the closest he got to a life lesson. His kingdom had become a glittering sensory overload, a place where nothing was soft, edible, or breathable in any conventional sense. Even flowers in the garden solidified into golden versions of themselves, looking pretty, but completely useless for, smelling, touching, or basic photosynthesis. Birds, insects, and random wildlife avoided the palace like it was a cursed exhibit in a natural history museum, and Midas's ego swelled in tandem with the weight of everything he touched, which was ironically heavier than his judgment. Every step was loud, clunky, and a little horrifying as the realization sank in that his billionaire energy had turned the entire kingdom into a shiny, unusable art installation. Still, he carried on with blind enthusiasm, touching chairs, cups, and statues with gleeful abandon, until even the most patient among his advisors muttered, maybe this wasn't the smartest choice. But Midas, in full delusional stride, ignored all subtlety, stroking his new golden floors, examining walls that now resembled treasure vaults, and thinking, yes, this is exactly the flex I wanted. It was intoxicating at first, undeniably satisfying, and completely unsustainable, a lesson in instant gratification wrapped in a literal metallic shell. Soon, he would find out just how cruel the universe can be when it hands you exactly what you asked for. As Midas continued his golden spree, the palace began to transform into what historians would later call a glittery nightmare masquerading as luxury. And honestly, it was hard to argue. Every corner, every surface, every decorative flourish became a monument to his impulsive ego. Chairs turned rigid, tables became unintentionally lethal, and even the roses in the garden were no longer soft petals, but shiny, metallic approximations that screamed, "Look at me," while quietly murdering any chance of fragrance. The walls, previously painted with pastoral scenes, now glimmered with such intensity that visitors needed sunglasses, which in retrospect was probably a subconscious warning from the universe. Midas, however, was in full flex mode, inspecting everything with a grin, like a kid who just discovered a candy store that doubles as a prison. The guards clomped down the halls, groaning, under the weight of suddenly solid doors, and servants shuffled around with trays that might as well have been anvils, wondering how their lives had turned into an ancient version of a heavy-lifting CrossFit challenge. The floors echoed with every step, metallic clangs bouncing back like a soundtrack designed by someone who hated subtlety. Even the fountains, once filled with water, were frozen in golden streams, no longer functional, but undeniably impressive if your primary aesthetic was "I will blind you with my wealth." Midas, of course, had zero practical awareness. He touched statues of animals, fruit, and random decorative objects with glee, ignoring all social cues that might indicate maybe this is getting out of hand. His advisors, meanwhile, began subtly panicking, pointing out that while this looked amazing, it might not actually be sustainable for eating, drinking, or general life. But Midas waved them off, strutting through his increasingly hazardous kingdom like a man auditioning for the role of most extravagant disaster in history. Even meals became an obstacle course. Plates solidified before food could be placed on them, goblets hardened mid-toast, and napkins became golden sheets of annoyance. Birds avoided the palace, small animals fled, and the occasional merchant who dared enter left with a mix of awe and trauma, carrying back tales that would echo for generations. Midas, however, saw none of this as a problem. Every surface glittered, every object sparkled, and in his mind he had reached the pinnacle of human ingenuity. Yet, amid the shininess, there was a creeping realization, a whisper of reality starting to poke through the glittery veneer. The kingdom, though dazzling, had become impractical. Comfort, nutrition, and basic social interaction were all casualties of his new reality. The golden touch, initially a thrill, was evolving into a slow, gleaming trap. And though Midas still smiled, the first hints of worry flickered behind his eyes like shadows against reflective walls. The palace had become a monument to hubris, a literal cage of excess, where every shiny object was both a trophy and a warning. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, that he stubbornly refused to acknowledge, Midas was about to learn that not all rewards are as sweet as they appear, especially when they bite back in the hardest way imaginable. The golden curse didn't care about social norms or Midas's carefully curated ego. It cared about one thing: consequences. Breakfast, which had once been the highlight of any monarch's morning, became the cruelest joke the universe could deliver. Midas sat at the table, eagerly reaching for a warm loaf of bread, imagining that satisfying crunch and comforting aroma, only to feel the cold, hard reality of a loaf instantly solidifying into gold the moment his fingers grazed it. He stared, mouth slightly open, at what was now a rock masquerading as food, and for a brief, fleeting second, even his ego faltered. He tried a piece, thinking maybe he could gnaw through it, but golden bread does not bend to mortal teeth, no matter how kingly you think you are. Eggs, once a reliable source of protein and satisfaction, snapped into shiny orbs that reflected the morning sun like miniature suns themselves, leaving him hungry and increasingly panicked. Wine, which had fueled decades of philosophical debate and drunken mistakes, turned into metallic sludge, leaving the king parched and bitterly aware that the very pleasures that had defined his life were now weaponized against him. Midas's advisors sighed collectively, realizing that their king's dream of ultimate wealth had quickly mutated into a survival nightmare. Servants tiptoed around tables that had become traps, holding trays like Olympic athletes competing in the heavy gold-carrying event, silently mourning the simpler days of normal food and drink. Birds outside squawked, probably judging him for this rapid descent from opulence to absurdity. Even his own reflection, once a source of vanity and pride, now seemed mocking, glinting from every surface with an almost smug awareness of his predicament. Hunger gnawed at him, a sensation he hadn't expected to coexist with so much gold, and for the first time, Midas realized that the very thing he had coveted above all else was actively sabotaging him. The golden touch, a symbol of greed and unchecked desire, had transformed from a thrill into an existential inconvenience, a relentless reminder that fun and disaster often ride in the same carriage. His throne, previously a majestic seat of power, felt more like a trap as he perched atop it, tapping at his golden breakfast like a man pleading with the universe to make an exception. The irony was suffocating. Midas, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, couldn't eat, drink, or interact meaningfully with anyone, trapped in a palace of gleaming isolation. And as the realization sank in, a creeping dread settled over him, one that was equal parts hunger, regret, and dawning comprehension that perhaps the best gifts in life aren't shiny at all. It was a rude awakening, a morning Midas would never forget, marking the exact point where luxury collided spectacularly with practical misery, and where the universe proved that no amount of gold can substitute for the basics of human life. The king's stomach rumbled like a low drumbeat of karmic justice, setting the stage for lessons in humility that were about to get very personal, very quickly. Even Midas's beloved wine, the one indulgence he had truly mastered over years of practice, betrayed him spectacularly. The first sip, once a moment of liquid bliss, instantly transformed into a solid, gleaming cylinder of gold, clinking against the rim of the cup with a sound that might have been impressive in a concert hall, but was absolutely useless in his mouth. He stared at it, dumbfounded, swirling it like a sommelier who had suddenly realized the grapes had unionized and quit forever. The irony was brutal. A king who had prized the finest vintages now found himself dehydrated and suffering, his reward doubling as a personal roast from the universe. Even the smallest indulgences, fruit, bread, or the simple pleasure of pouring a drink, had become acts of cruel futility. Midas lifted the cup to his lips again, just in case, and it clanged back as hard as reality could. His fingers trembled, partly in disbelief, partly because the sheer weight of what he was holding might have cracked a mortal wrist. Servants tiptoed past, eyes darting nervously between the rigid objects littering the table and the king's rapidly diminishing patience. Outside, birds and small animals avoided the palace entirely, as if they had sensed the metaphysical horror within, an entire kingdom transformed into something too shiny to survive in, a trap wrapped in ostentation. The king, for the first time, began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the universe had a sense of humor at his expense, one that required patience, a little humility, and a lot of melted common sense he clearly didn't have. He realized his obsession with gold had blinded him not just to practicality, but to joy, companionship, and the simple comforts of life that can't be minted. Even the walls, the floors, and the furniture, all previously expressions of his grand aesthetic, now felt like a prison, gleaming and beautiful, but wholly unlivable. Midas sat back in his golden chair, sighing audibly, a sound that reverberated through his metallic hallways like the drumbeat of karmic payback. The king's initial excitement, his euphoric flex of turning everything into wealth, was fading, replaced by the creeping, undeniable reality of isolation and deprivation. Every object he touched was a reminder that his genius wish had come with the sort of fine print that gods delight in hiding. It looked amazing, but it was lethal to function. Midas tried to drink from a fountain, only to see the water solidify mid-flow, leaving him dripping in shiny, useless humiliation. Hunger and thirst gnawed at him, frustration bubbled over, and his ego began its slow, uncomfortable deflation, punctuated by muttered curses at his own brilliance. The king's life had shifted from indulgence to survival in the blink of a divine eye, and in that moment he learned a simple, brutal truth. Unlimited wealth is meaningless if it can't sustain the very basics of human existence. Even his wine, once the symbol of pleasure, had become a golden warning of how quickly greed can turn against you, a lesson that would follow him like a shadow in the days to come. The moment Midas truly realized that greed stops being cute came like a slap with a golden glove. At first, the novelty of turning objects into gold had been fun. He felt like a kid playing with the most expensive toys imaginable. But that thrill evaporated as practical reality barged in uninvited. Chairs, tables, and decorative fruits were shiny and impressive, yes, but entirely useless for sitting, eating, or human interaction. The king quickly noticed that even the simplest daily tasks had become Herculean challenges. Lifting a fork now required a strength he didn't possess, and pouring wine, already ruined, was an exercise in futility and frustration. Hunger, thirst, and general discomfort gnawed at him, blending into a cocktail of existential dread. Servants moved cautiously, carrying trays that felt like anvils, while guards muttered under their breath about how their boss had officially lost it, yet no one dared say it aloud. Even Midas's reflection in the golden mirror seemed to mock him, glinting with smug irony that suggested, "This is what you asked for, buddy." He had amassed wealth beyond imagination, yet he could not eat, drink, or hug another human without accidentally murdering them with a touch. The realization hit hard. Absolute greed is not liberating. It's a cage, shiny as it might be. He attempted to sip water, only for it to solidify instantly, leaving him parched and bitter. A loaf of bread became a rock mid-slice. An apple turned to solid metal the moment it left the basket. Even flowers in his garden, once soft and fragrant, were now rigid, golden sculptures that mocked his once gleeful indulgence. Slowly, the novelty that had intoxicated him shifted into a gnawing horror. Midas began pacing his palace like a man trapped in a glittering labyrinth, counting consequences instead of coins. The walls, the floors, the furniture, all trophies of his own hubris, reminded him constantly that luxury without practicality is a trap. He remembered the warnings he'd ignored, the subtle hints from advisors, and the universe's quiet chuckle as each element of his life became solid and useless. Social interactions were impossible. Even a handshake or a comforting touch threatened to turn a person into a statue. Pride, his once dominant companion, began to waver, replaced by regret so thick it felt almost tangible, like a golden fog. Midas realized painfully that what he had thought would elevate him to legendary status was, in fact, suffocating him in opulence. The king's isolation deepened, his physical needs unmet, and his ego, once untouchable, was humbled by circumstance. The palace, glittering as it was, had become a monument to the worst kind of human flaw, the insatiable desire for more without foresight. This dawning clarity marked the first real moment in which Midas truly comprehended that wealth is meaningless if it can't support life itself. His obsession had not only failed to satisfy him, it had turned his world into a prison of his own making. The tragedy of Midas's golden touch reached a personal crescendo when even the simplest human connection became hazardous. One morning, eager to embrace his daughter, or perhaps just desperate for some genuine warmth, he reached out with trembling hands, expecting comfort, affection, maybe a little human grounding. Instead, the skin of his daughter, delicate and warm, hardened instantly under his touch, shimmering in metallic horror, leaving her frozen mid-step with a face of pure terror. Midas recoiled, heart hammering, eyes wide, and stomach twisting. In a cocktail of panic and guilt, he hadn't even known existed. The horrifying reality hit him with the force of a collapsing chandelier. His golden touch wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. Every instinct to reach out, to connect, to reassure someone he loved, became a potential disaster. Servants, who had already been navigating the metallic maze of his palace, stared in shocked silence, their previous whispered frustrations now replaced with visible horror. The king's ego, usually unshakable, crumbled into shards as he realized the personal cost of his reckless wish. Friends, family, even casual acquaintances were now at risk of literal petrification. Affection had been weaponized, trust rendered dangerous. Midas attempted to pull away, shaking, muttering apologies that sounded hollow even to himself, while the golden glow of his daughter served as a silent, glittering indictment of his impulsiveness. Every embrace, handshake, or casual pat of reassurance now carried the possibility of turning love into lifeless metal, and the psychological toll was immediate. Guilt gnawed at him, a bitter aftertaste to the intoxicating thrill that had driven him to greed in the first place. He wandered the palace in near silence, staring at the rigid, golden forms of those he cared for, each frozen figure a reminder of what ambition unchecked by reason could destroy. Even the walls, floors, and furniture, once mere annoyances, seemed to mock him, reflecting the cruel symmetry of his folly. Midas now understood that wealth, power, and glory could never substitute for the simple, irreplaceable bonds of human connection. The golden touch, initially a symbol of ultimate control and status, had revealed itself as a merciless teacher, emphasizing consequences over triumphs. Panic set in, not only for the immediate risk of harming others, but also for the emotional devastation he had wrought upon himself. The king's lavish lifestyle, once the envy of Phrygia, now felt hollow, gilded over tragedy, and impossible to navigate. In the midst of his despair, Midas's thoughts flickered to Dionysus, the god who had granted this blessing, and he began to see the subtle cruelty in divine irony, a reward designed to teach a lesson, and the lesson had arrived in the harshest, most personal form possible. Every gold-covered figure, every metallic ornament, every glinting surface reinforced the realization that hubris comes at a price, and sometimes that price is heartbreak, made manifest in cold, unyielding metal. The palace, dazzling yet deadly, had become a monument to regret, and Midas finally faced the terrifying truth that the very touch he had once celebrated was now a weapon against everything he loved. The panic that had quietly simmered in Midas's gilded halls now exploded into full-blown chaos, a spectacle that would have made any ancient historian raise an eyebrow and mutter, "Well, someone really did that to themselves." Servants scrambled, slipping on floors that had hardened into sheets of reflective gold, clutching trays that weighed more than a small horse, while guards tried, mostly unsuccessfully, to navigate corridors that had turned into a metallic funhouse designed by an over-ambitious prankster. Advisors muttered frantically, some pacing, some kneeling in disbelief, all desperately attempting to mitigate the fallout of a king who had managed to weaponize his own hands. Even the palace pets, previously pampered and mildly annoying, seemed to grasp the absurdity of the situation, scuttling off to safer corners where human touch couldn't doom them to shiny permanence. The atmosphere was thick with tension and metallic tang, a heady mix of fear, awe, and judgment, as everyone silently acknowledged that the king's obsession with gold had escalated into full-blown disaster theater. Midas moved through the chaos, touching walls, furniture, even the occasional decorative fruit, all while muttering curses and lamentations under his breath. He could barely grasp the reality that his own life, once comfortable and grand, had become a gilded trap. The more he tried to control it, the more uncontrollable it became. Every metallic object, once a testament to his ego, now served as a cruel reminder of the consequences of unchecked desire. Servants flinched as the king's fingers brushed against surfaces, holding their collective breath, praying their own proximity wouldn't inadvertently render them part of the palace's growing display of disaster. Guards exchanged wary glances, silently noting that training in combat and protocol offered no preparation for a sovereign capable of turning his own environment into an unlivable, glittering labyrinth. Even the faintest whisper of normalcy, a tray of bread, a water jug, was tainted by the fear that Midas's touch could convert it instantly into a rigid, useless metallic form. The palace, once a symbol of wealth and status, now resembled a surreal, nightmarish gallery where each golden object silently taunted its creator. Midas, pacing and muttering, began to experience the creeping realization that his actions had far-reaching consequences, not just for himself, but for everyone under his roof. Hunger gnawed at him, thirst parched him, and the inability to engage safely with his own people compounded his panic into a spiraling mess of regret. The more he moved, the more he turned things to gold. The more he turned things to gold, the deeper his isolation became. Advisors tried desperately to speak, offering practical solutions, but the king's pride and despair tangled together, making him alternately dismissive and tearful. And in the midst of this gilded nightmare, Midas began to understand, perhaps for the first time, that his obsession with material wealth had created not only a palace of gold, but a prison of his own making, a monument to excess, folly, and the terrifying cost of desire untempered by wisdom. By the time reality fully sank in, Midas had abandoned any pretense of pride and was reduced to pleading, literally begging, with the one entity capable of undoing his golden mess, Dionysus. His voice, hoarse from panic and self-recrimination, echoed through the shimmering halls as he called out, hands trembling over tables, chairs, and statues that gleamed mockingly under the morning sun. Pride, that ever-present companion of his, had evaporated completely, replaced by a desperate, almost childlike vulnerability. He remembered the moment of wish-making, the thrill of instant wealth, and the intoxicating novelty of touching objects that transformed at his command, and he felt a sharp sting of shame that cut deeper than any hunger or thirst. Servants, long accustomed to tiptoeing around their eccentric king, watched in muted sympathy, wondering how long a mortal could endure the weight of both guilt and impractical gold. Guards flinched at every gesture, silently willing their sovereign to keep his fingers to himself, aware that the line between wealth and catastrophe had become paper-thin. Midas's desperation escalated as he recounted each personal tragedy wrought by his own hands, spoiled meals, parched lips, and the horrifying solidification of everything and everyone he tried to embrace. Tears threatened to spill as he realized that his love, his family, and even simple human touch had become casualties of his obsession. The palace, gleaming as it was, now reflected not triumph, but the crushing weight of consequences, a glittering prison that mirrored his mental state. And so, Midas turned his gaze heavenward, voice cracking, and implored Dionysus to intervene. He begged for relief, for a chance to undo the reckless wish that had seemed so brilliant in the moment of pride. The king's pleas were unpolished, raw, and genuine, a far cry from the confident, flamboyant ruler who had once laughed at warnings and dismissed advice. Dionysus, being a god with a flair for dramatic timing, likely watched with a mix of amusement and judgment, aware that the moment of crisis was the perfect counterbalance to Midas's prior hubris. There was no theatrics in the king's approach this time. No exaggerated displays of wealth or power, only the stark, naked recognition that his actions had consequences, that his obsession with gold had placed him in a position of profound helplessness. The kingdom held its collective breath, witnessing a monarch humbled to the core, reduced to the most human of experiences, regret, fear, and an urgent need for redemption. Every reflective surface, every golden object around him seemed to amplify his anxiety, turning the palace into a hall of mirrors for shame. Midas's ego, once untouchable and gleaming like the gold he adored, was now shattered and pleading, marking the turning point from reckless indulgence to desperate accountability. The king's recognition that he had no recourse except divine intervention set the stage for the next act, one in which the gods' mercy would arrive, but not without a side of cosmic irony that only a deity could deliver. The path to relief would demand humility, patience, and a readiness to confront the literal weight of greed in all its glittering, inconvenient glory. Dionysus, ever the dramatic problem solver, agreed to help Midas, but true to divine style, his mercy came served with a side of subtle, almost cheeky sarcasm. He didn't just snap his fingers or mutter a quick incantation. No, that would be too easy. And where's the fun in that? Instead, he instructed Midas to wash away the golden touch in the waters of the river Pactolus, which immediately had the king scrambling like a man whose life had been redesigned into a bad workout challenge. The god's instructions were precise but delivered with that sly, judging grin that gods love, equal parts helpful, and I told you so. Midas, panting, dripping with guilt and metaphorical sweat, realized this was his moment of redemption, if he could just follow directions without turning something else into a glittering trap along the way. Servants, still navigating the metallic minefield that his palace had become, quietly mused that even divine solutions could involve a ridiculous amount of coordination when your king is a walking hazard. The journey, as trivial as it might have seemed from a mortal perspective, required focus, care, and the constant suppression of the instinct to touch everything in sight, something Midas had failed at spectacularly before. The god's tone, though gentle, carried the weight of cosmic judgment. One misstep, and the lessons of humility would be reinforced with further gilded chaos. Midas set out, moving carefully through corridors where gold glittered underfoot and reflected his panicked expression back at him in 1,000 tiny, mocking mirrors. Even the simplest act, walking, lifting a hand, adjusting his crown, was fraught with risk, a lesson in restraint and mindfulness that wealth had never taught him. The king's steps carried him closer to the river, each stride a combination of fear, hope, and a new understanding of what it truly means to handle power responsibly. Outside, the sunlight bounced off gilded surfaces, and the air smelled faintly of metal and regret, a constant reminder of the path he had carved for himself. Midas had no time for distractions. Every reflective object seemed to taunt him, whispering, "Remember, this is your doing," and he shuddered, recalling meals ruined, loved ones endangered, and the sheer absurdity of having a kingdom rendered nearly unlivable by his own hands. The palace, once a haven of indulgence, had become a lesson in patience, humility, and the painful consequences of unchecked desire, a glittering prelude to the catharsis awaiting him at the river. As he approached the banks of the Pactolus, Midas felt a strange mixture of hope and trepidation. Salvation was within reach, but only if he respected the rules, controlled his impulses, and embraced the bitter pill of accountability that the golden curse had forced down his throat. Dionysus's divine sarcasm lingered in the air, a subtle reminder that true wisdom rarely comes without a dose of humiliation, and that the king's shiny mistakes were about to meet a watery, glitter-diluting reckoning. Midas's journey to the river Pactolus was less heroic march and more frantic shuffle, as the full weight of his impulsive greed pressed down on him with every step. The golden touch had made even the act of walking a hazard. Branches, rocks, and the occasional wandering animal were all threats in his metallicized world, and Midas had to move carefully, balancing panic with the strange excitement that came from nearly ruining everything he touched. The countryside stretched out before him, rolling hills and green fields now partially reflecting the sunlight off stray gold he had accidentally scattered in the palace gardens, little nuggets that glinted like a warning. Your mistakes follow you. Birds flitted nervously above, having clearly learned the hard way that the king's aura was lethal. Despite the chaos he carried on his person, Midas felt a flicker of hope. The Pactolus promised a chance to reverse the curse, to reclaim something resembling normalcy, and perhaps even to restore the human connections that had been turned into statues of regret. Still, the journey wasn't without its comic absurdities. He slipped over a golden rock, nearly face-planting into a field of wildflowers that refused to shine, and muttered curses that echoed off the hills like a man scolding the universe itself. Travelers and farmers watched from a distance, unsure whether to intervene or assume the king's weird glow was some divine marketing stunt. The closer Midas got to the river, the heavier the air seemed, weighted with both expectation and the lingering scent of metallic catastrophe. Each step reminded him of dinners ruined, hugs gone wrong, and the sheer impracticality of having unlimited wealth. Yet there was a determination in his pace, a quiet acknowledgement that the remedy required patience, humility, and careful execution, qualities that had been sorely lacking in his palace-bound antics. The riverbanks, shimmering with sunlight, seemed to hum with the promise of relief, yet also with the quiet judgment of centuries of myth, whispering that a king who had toyed with divine power would pay attention this time or face consequences again. Midas approached the water with cautious reverence, dipping a hand in first, half expecting the liquid to turn to molten gold instantly. But the Pactolus held no such trickery. It was a patient, neutral agent, ready to wash away the curse if he could surrender to the process. The journey, arduous and ridiculous as it had been, had prepared him for this moment. A confrontation between hubris and humility, impulse and restraint. Midas's mind raced, replaying his past mistakes, imagining the golden statues of his former missteps scattered across the palace, and wondering how a single moment of overconfidence could nearly destroy everything. Yet, amid the panic and absurdity, there was clarity. Redemption was close, tangible, and for the first time, within his control, if he could resist touching anything else in a gleeful panic. The river awaited, calm and indifferent, reflecting the sky and offering a quiet solution that contrasted sharply with the chaos of his kingdom. And as Midas prepared to step fully into its waters, he felt the weight of gold, guilt, and impatience start to shift, a tangible sense that the curse's grip might finally loosen if he could only follow through without faltering. Stepping into the waters of the Pactolus, Midas felt a strange mix of relief and absurdity, like someone finally giving you a life jacket after watching you drown in a kiddie pool of your own making. The cool current lapped against his legs, washing away the panic that had been thick in the palace halls, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe without fearing every object in reach. He submerged his hands fully, remembering Dionysus's precise instructions, and felt the odd sensation of gold slipping away, like a heavy, invisible weight dissolving into the riverbed. Each finger that emerged from the water seemed lighter, freer, and the horrifying memories of solidified meals and frozen embraces began to recede, slightly, replaced by hope that the human touch could return without catastrophic consequences. The river's current, patient and unbothered, carried away the cursed glitter of his mistakes, swirling it downstream as if the world itself were tidying up after his reckless indulgence. He looked at his reflection in the water and, for the first time, saw a man who had been humbled in the most absurd way possible, a king who had chased wealth with zero foresight, nearly murdered his own relationships with flair, and learned that shiny objects are not synonymous with happiness. Midas's stomach, still empty, but now slightly more optimistic, grumbled in protest, reminding him that survival was both literal and metaphorical. Wealth meant nothing if basic needs couldn't be met. Servants, who had followed him cautiously to the riverbank, blinked in relief as the gleam of gold on his hands softened, realizing that their labor-intensive nightmare might finally be ending. Birds returned cautiously to the banks, hopping near the water with tentative curiosity, perhaps judging the human who had nearly turned everything into blinding metal. The king moved carefully, experimenting with touches on nearby stones and reeds, half expecting them to solidify. But each time they remained exactly as they were, soft, malleable, alive in a way he hadn't felt for days. The absurdity of his prior obsession clashed with the simple relief of ordinary things, grass underfoot, water flowing freely, and the ability to hold something without turning it into an unlivable monument. Midas realized that his most treasured asset wasn't gold, it was connection, movement, the simple pleasures of life that can't be minted or measured in carats. The river, neutral yet deeply instructive, became both a literal and symbolic cleansing, a reminder that recklessness can be reversed if humility, patience, and willingness to learn are applied, albeit after a ridiculous amount of suffering. The king's thoughts flickered back to Dionysus, the god whose clever mixture of mercy and judgment had orchestrated this lesson, a cosmic nudge that combined sarcasm, timing, and life-or-death reality checks. By the time he stepped fully out of the river, Midas's hands no longer glimmered with the dangerous allure of gold. They were human again, capable of touch, warmth, and genuine interaction. The experience had reshaped his understanding of wealth, power, and responsibility, forcing him to recognize that the shiny things he had coveted were meaningless without practicality and human connection. With each step back toward his palace, the king carried not only relief, but a newfound respect for moderation, foresight, and the simple joys that wealth cannot purchase. Returning to the palace, Midas found a kingdom both familiar and unrecognizable, a landscape still glinting faintly from the remnants of his obsession, but softened now, like a nightmare after sunrise. Floors that had once weighed tons under his touch seemed ordinary again, and chairs no longer threatened to crush anyone foolish enough to sit. The servants exhaled collectively, some laughing nervously, others wiping sweat and tears from days of gilded chaos, while guards slumped in relief, realizing that the king could finally navigate his own palace without inadvertently creating a metallic hazard zone. Midas, still shaky from his river baptism, cautiously approached his daughter, hand extended with all the humility a once arrogant monarch could muster. The moment his fingers met her skin, warmth returned unimpeded, the golden sheen gone, leaving her blinking and human, very much alive, and possibly judging him silently for what had just happened. He felt a deep, almost shocking rush of emotion, realizing that human touch, once taken for granted, was now infinitely more valuable than anything glittering. Around him, the palace had a slightly tarnished shine, the objects still luxurious but no longer cursed. The gold remained in some areas as decoration, but it no longer held the power to harm. Midas walked slowly through the halls, touching tables, candlesticks, and decorative items experimentally, testing the boundaries of normalcy, each successful interaction a small triumph over his past folly. Servants whispered in relief, and even the birds that had abandoned the palace returned cautiously, chirping as though acknowledging the restored balance. The king paused at a table that had once been nearly unmanageable in weight, now perfectly functional, and laughed softly at the absurdity of his previous obsession. He reflected on the intense lessons learned. Wealth, while alluring, could not replace nourishment, connection, or sanity. Impulsive indulgence was hazardous, and even gods enjoyed a well-timed lesson in irony. Midas, for the first time in weeks, felt a sense of gratitude that went beyond material objects, gratitude for human touch, ordinary food, and the subtle, grounding pleasures of life that do not sparkle. He made a mental promise to approach his kingdom and wealth with greater care, understanding that his power carried responsibility, and that hubris could turn any privilege into a curse. The experience had reshaped not only his understanding of gold, but his perspective on life itself. Objects that once symbolized vanity now reminded him of moderation, humility, and the foolish joy of reckless desire tempered by consequence. Every corner of the palace seemed to echo with the lessons of the past, whispering that mistakes, while painful, could be corrected with reflection and effort. Midas, slowly regaining composure, began to reconnect with his people, his family, and the world beyond the glittering prison he had once created, learning that true wealth lies not in metal, but in balance, care, and the ability to touch life without destroying it. And as the sun streamed through the windows, glinting off the remaining golden accents, Midas felt the first genuine peace he had known in weeks, a quiet victory over the chaos he had once embraced so recklessly. In the days following his near catastrophe, Midas discovered that life in the palace carried a new rhythm, one shaped less by obsession and more by deliberate thought, a lesson hard-earned in the glare of gold and the hush of regret. Breakfast resumed their normal function, with bread that could be chewed, wine that could be sipped, and fruit that wouldn't snap like brittle sculptures under his fingers. The servants moved freely again, relieved to navigate corridors without fear of instant petrification, and guards patrolled with a new lightness, their previous tension replaced by cautious optimism. Midas, now painfully aware of the consequences of his impulsive desires, found himself observing the world differently. The shimmer of gold no longer elicited frantic excitement, but a subtle appreciation for beauty without obsession. He touched furniture, candlesticks, and decorative objects with a careful mindfulness, testing each interaction, learning that restraint and awareness were as valuable as any material possession. His daughter, no longer a glittering statue, approached him cautiously at first, and the king, humbled, welcomed her touch without hesitation, savoring the warmth and impermanence of human connection. Even the birds that had abandoned the palace cautiously returned to the gardens, their presence a quiet affirmation that the world could recover from human folly given patience and care. Midas began to reflect on the absurdity of his previous choices, imagining himself as a cautionary tale, a monarch blinded by wealth, nearly losing everything that mattered for the thrill of shiny excess. He laughed quietly at the memory, not mockingly, but with an ironic awareness of how ridiculous his obsession had been, a personal acknowledgement of human weakness and divine humor. Advisors, previously tense with worry, found their king more approachable, more grounded, and curiously more capable of empathy, having been confronted with the tangible consequences of his greed. The palace, while still adorned with gold, no longer felt oppressive. The glitter now served as a subtle reminder of lessons learned rather than a weaponized obsession. Midas found joy in the ordinary, food that could be eaten, wine that could be savored, conversations that could be shared without fear. The experience had reshaped not only his relationship with wealth, but his understanding of responsibility, patience, and the limits of desire. Even the river, where he had shed the golden curse, became a place of reflection, a gentle reminder that mistakes, though humiliating, could be corrected if humility and action were applied. Midas began to move through his restored kingdom with a new energy, cautious, thoughtful, yet quietly triumphant in having survived both his own greed and the ironic interventions of the gods. The palace, now alive with human warmth, laughter, and activity, seemed to breathe again, shedding the suffocating weight of gold that had once turned it into a gilded prison. In this quieter, more measured rhythm, Midas began to rebuild not just his wealth, but his understanding of life, love, and the true value of touch, nourishment, and connection. Midas quickly realized that the true wealth of a kingdom wasn't measured in gold, coins, or glittering treasures, but in relationships, trust, and the ability to touch and be touched without fear. His advisors, once wary and silently resentful, began to notice subtle changes in their king. He listened more, considered the consequences of his decisions, and even cracked jokes that weren't about shiny objects, much to everyone's relief. Meals, once a gauntlet of dangerous metallic traps, became communal events again, filled with laughter, clinking of normal cups, and the occasional teasing remark from his daughter, who reminded him that food existed to be eaten, not admired. The palace, still adorned with gilded accents as a nod to his former hubris, no longer carried the oppressive weight of unchecked obsession. Instead, it served as a lesson, a reminder that even the grandest indulgences could become prisons without moderation. Midas spent hours wandering the restored halls, touching objects carefully, savoring the tactile reassurance that ordinary materials were once again safe, and appreciating the simple pleasure of a chair that didn't threaten to crush him. The kingdom outside, hearing tales of his golden misadventure, treated him with a mix of amusement, relief, and lingering awe. The story of a king who had turned his world into a metallic trap and survived became a cautionary legend, whispered among merchants, travelers, and storytellers alike. Birds returned to the gardens in cautious flutters, the wind carried scents of normalcy, and the river Pactolus quietly shimmered downstream, carrying traces of Midas's folly as a subtle, permanent reminder that hubris could be washed away, but lessons endured. The king found himself smiling at the absurdity of it all, a man nearly undone by his own desires, humbled by consequences, and now learning to value what truly mattered. Servants, guards, and family members cautiously approached him with renewed trust, reassured by his tempered judgment and careful restraint. Even the most cautious advisors began to see a king capable of genuine wisdom, someone who had faced the ultimate consequences of greed and emerged alive, humbled, and a little wiser for it. Midas took particular joy in interacting with his daughter, savoring the return of touch and warmth without the ever-present fear of petrification. He realized that material wealth had blinded him to the emotional and social wealth that truly defined life, and he vowed to prioritize connection, empathy, and thoughtful decision-making over mere accumulation. The palace, once a glittering nightmare, now reflected a balance between beauty and utility, opulence and human necessity. Through this harrowing ordeal, Midas had learned that even divine gifts could be traps if wielded without wisdom, and that humility, patience, and reflection were the real treasures a king could cultivate. And as he moved through his restored kingdom, the glimmering remnants of gold served not as temptation, but as a daily, subtle reminder. Desire unchecked can be destructive, but carefully managed, it can coexist with life, love, and genuine human experience. Midas had been taught, in the most absurdly extravagant way imaginable, that the greatest wealth is not what glitters, it is what endures in the human heart. Midas, now tempered by the absurdly harsh lessons of his golden touch, began to think differently about governance, wealth, and the small joys of life he had once ignored. He walked through markets and fields, noting the labor of his people with a newfound appreciation, realizing that wealth is only meaningful when it benefits others and not just inflates one's ego. Farmers, merchants, and craftsmen, who had once whispered behind his back about his bizarre obsession with turning everything into gold, now greeted him with cautious respect, seeing a king who had survived his own folly and returned wiser. The palace, once suffocating with gleaming excess, had become a space that balanced beauty with practicality. Gilded columns and decorative flourishes remained as reminders of past mistakes, but they no longer dictated the daily lives of those within. Midas experimented with distributing wealth more sensibly, commissioning functional items that retained aesthetic appeal without threatening anyone's safety, and he began encouraging trade and commerce that strengthened the kingdom rather than turning it into a literal hazard zone. He noticed, almost for the first time, the satisfaction in ordinary moments, eating a simple meal without fear, sharing laughter with his daughter, walking through corridors that responded normally underfoot. The king also reflected on the divine irony of Dionysus's intervention. The god had delivered punishment with just enough drama to make the lesson unforgettable, yet left Midas room to learn, recover, and grow. There was humor in hindsight. The absurdity of wanting ultimate wealth and nearly destroying everything he loved now felt almost cartoonish. Yet the pain and panic had been utterly real. Servants whispered about the Golden King with both awe and relief, telling new stories of how their sovereign had been humbled by glitter, yet had emerged capable of empathy, restraint, and practical wisdom. Birds and wildlife cautiously returned to the gardens, as if acknowledging that the environment had been restored to livable conditions. Even the Pactolus, carrying remnants of dissolved gold downstream, served as a quiet, sparkling testament to the consequences of unchecked desire. Midas came to understand that the kingdom's prosperity was not measured in accumulation, but in balance. Wealth, safety, human connection, and respect for nature and community. He walked through the halls, touching tables, books, and simple decorations with care, appreciating the ordinary textures of life that he had once taken for granted. Conversations with his advisors shifted from sycophantic praise to genuine discourse, and he began to listen, to weigh, and to act thoughtfully, realizing that leadership was as much about restraint as it was about authority. Even his daughter's laughter, free of golden curse-induced terror, became a symbol of restored harmony, a reminder that love and family were treasures far more valuable than any glittering metal. Slowly, the lessons of greed, isolation, and divine irony settled into wisdom, giving Midas a chance to rebuild not just his kingdom, but his character, his relationships, and his understanding of true wealth. The kind that doesn't blind, suffocate, or petrify, but nourishes, connects, and endures. Over the following months, Midas's perspective on life continued to evolve in ways that were both subtle and profound, a shift born not of fear alone, but of lived experience, the sort of absurdly expensive life lesson only a golden touch could deliver. He began to notice the ordinary rhythms of the kingdom, the quiet hustle of markets, the simple pleasure of children playing in the streets, and the natural beauty of trees, flowers, and rivers untouched by his previous obsession. Whereas once he had been obsessed with accumulation, now he found joy in moderation, in the satisfaction of seeing his people thrive without fear of being crushed, roasted, or accidentally turned into trophies. Servants, relieved at no longer having to tiptoe through a metallic minefield, laughed more freely, and the palace, while still glimmering in places, had the warmth of a home rather than a shrine to vanity. Midas's relationship with his daughter grew stronger, filled with genuine affection and normal human touch, a daily reminder that love and connection were wealth far beyond any material measure. Advisors noticed a more thoughtful and reflective king, one who weighed decisions carefully and sought the welfare of his people rather than just the gleam of his own ego. Birds returned, small animals ventured cautiously into the palace grounds, and even distant travelers began to speak in awed tones of the once gilded monarch who had survived his folly and emerged both wiser and strangely charming in his humility. Midas also began to appreciate the story he would leave behind, not as a boast of wealth, but as a cautionary tale, a legend that spoke of ambition, hubris, divine irony, and redemption. The palace, the gardens, and even the river Pactolus became living reminders of the absurdity and gravity of unchecked desire, teaching that wealth could delight or destroy depending on one's approach. Each day, as he moved through his now functional kingdom, Midas reflected on his journey, the thrill of creation, the horror of consequence, and the quiet satisfaction of restored balance. He touched objects with care, mindful of the past but grateful for the present, aware that a king's true power lay not in the glitter of gold, but in the impact he had on lives around him. Meals became joyful, shared events rather than treacherous exercises, and laughter returned to the halls in a way that had been impossible during the height of his obsession. The lessons of humility, restraint, and thoughtful indulgence were ingrained deeply, shaping a ruler who understood the double-edged nature of desire. Even when tempted to revisit old pleasures, Midas exercised restraint, appreciating that experience, touch, and connection were infinitely more satisfying than the hollow shine of gold. In embracing the human, he reclaimed his life, his relationships, and his kingdom, proving that wisdom could emerge even from the most ridiculous mistakes, and that redemption, when paired with reflection, could be genuinely transformative. The golden touch, once a symbol of reckless indulgence, had become a distant memory, a cautionary whisper against overreach, reminding him daily that the richest life is measured in love, moderation, and human warmth, not in coins or glitter. Years passed, and the story of King Midas and his golden touch became legend, whispered across generations not merely as a tale of wealth, but as a cautionary saga of greed, impulse, and the value of human connection. The palace, though still adorned with golden accents as a nod to history, no longer intimidated or dazzled to the point of absurdity. It had become a living testament to balance, where beauty, function, and humanity coexisted. Midas himself had transformed, the lessons etched into his daily routines, governance, and relationships, turning him into a ruler both wiser and surprisingly relatable, the kind of king whose mistakes could teach more than his triumphs ever could. He walked among his people with humility, touching, conversing, and laughing, fully aware of the power and responsibility of his presence, no longer blinded by the allure of shiny excess. His daughter, a constant reminder of what had been nearly lost, grew up in a home that now radiated warmth, not danger, where trust and affection were not punished by cursed magic. Advisors who had once whispered nervously behind his back now offered honest counsel openly, confident that Midas would listen with empathy rather than ego, and the kingdom flourished as a result, thriving in ways that wealth alone could never have achieved. Tales of the golden touch became a cultural touchstone, invoked by storytellers, philosophers, and parents alike to teach humility, foresight, and the peril of unchecked desire. Travelers spoke of the river Pactolus, still shimmering faintly with traces of dissolved gold, as a reminder that consequences could be reversed, but only through effort, patience, and reflection. Midas often visited the riverbank, gazing at the flowing waters with quiet gratitude, contemplating the strange mix of terror, absurdity, and divine irony that had reshaped his life. Even the palace gardens, once frozen in metallic perfection, now bloomed with vibrant life, a living metaphor for restoration and the rewards of careful stewardship. Over time, Midas came to understand that the greatest treasures were not minted, measured, or weighed, but felt. The warmth of human touch, the laughter of loved ones, the comfort of food, drink, and normalcy, and the satisfaction of a kingdom thriving under thoughtful leadership. The legend endured not for the spectacle of gold, but for the absurdly dramatic lesson it imparted, that unchecked desire could blind, isolate, and harm, but humility, care, and reflection could restore both life and joy. Midas's golden misadventure became a mirror for human folly and a guide toward wisdom, proving that even the most extravagant mistakes could be redeemed when met with honesty, courage, and effort. And though he had once been consumed by glitter, panic, and divine irony, Midas now walked confidently through a kingdom full of life, warmth, and laughter, a ruler reborn not by wealth, but by the enduring lessons of touch, connection, and the priceless value of ordinary, human existence. He often smiled quietly, reflecting on the absurdity of his past obsession, grateful for survival, wisdom, and the opportunity to live fully without turning everything and everyone he loved into a literal hazard. The golden touch remained a story, a warning, and a symbol, but Midas himself had become something rarer, a man who knew that the brightest shine comes from life, not metal.